Hi, I'm Kim,
And I'm Dev.
and you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up.
Do you love listening to the Criminalish podcast? Want to hear more from Cam and Dev? Then consider becoming a subscriber for $2.99 a month. Subscribers will have exclusive access to minisodes, Dev and Cam's live reactions to crime shows and documentaries, as well as early access to any multi-part episodes and so much more. Click the link in the description if you're interested in subscribing. See y'all in Cell Block C.
So, Dev and I are recording on the same day as our last episode, but for y'all who are just tuning back in, welcome back. And if you have not listened to part one of the case of Afrikka Hardy yet, go ahead, rewind, listen to that so that you have context. Before we get into part two of this case, Dev and I are still drinking the same thing with some water. But we are both drinking the Apothic Red Blend, rich and smooth, and having a great time.
Absolutely.
I am going to do a quick recap of part one, but before I get into that, I do just want to extend some trigger warnings for this second part. I will be discussing sexual assault, stalking, violence against women, physical and sexual harassment of a child, gang violence, mental illness, substance use, and I will briefly mention the death of a child. So that's a lot. If you're listening, I hope you are sitting down in a relaxing environment because I will say this part two is going to be a lot in terms of the topics that I'm going to be discussing.
I'm not ready, but I'm going to pretend I am, and I'm just going to drink my wine and listen.
And that's the best we can do. So, to recap, part one, on October 17th, 2014, Afrikka Hardy went to a motel in Hammond, Indiana to meet a client that she connected with through Backpage.com, which is an escort website. After not hearing from Afrikka for a while, her friend Shamika grew concerned and went to the motel with another friend to check things out. When they entered, they found Afrikka lying in the tub and she had been strangled to death. Police tracked down the man they saw on surveillance video, and he quickly admitted to the crime during the interrogation. This man, Darren Vann, eventually admitted to killing 6 other women. This is the story of Darren Vann and his crimes. So before I get too in the weeds of Darren's story, I just want to preface this by saying a lot of this information comes directly from Darren in his conversations with police and his defense attorney. However, Darren has been known to embellish many of the facts of his life. While some of what I mentioned might have happened, some of the occurrences of his life that seem more unrealistic might be due to the fact that Darren was telling these stories, but they didn't actually happen. Darren Vann was born March 21st, 1971. His mother had him at the age of 14 after being assaulted by her landlord. She had 3 more daughters quickly after this. And as you can imagine, a 14-year-old is ill-equipped to take care of one child, let alone 4. And at the age of 6, Darren was placed into foster care. He was frequently bounced around homes for around 5 to 6 years and was also frequently mistreated at many of the homes that he was placed in. He was eventually placed in a home called Thelma Marshall, which was a residential foster home that had 16 boys and 16 girls. Half of the children were young think below the age of 10 to 12, and the other half of the children were teenagers. According to Darren, the adults leading the house would leave around 5, and the children were left with counselors who were in their 20s and would force the children to fight and find other ways to torment him. Darren said that another teenager at the home tried to sexually assault him, but one of the other teenagers, a person he called Big E, found out about what was happening and had the teenager who was tormenting him killed. After the teenager named Big E allegedly had the person tormenting Darren killed, he ended up recruiting Darren into a gang because Big E was part of one of the gangs that operated out of Chicago. And this is where Darren said he learned how to kill. However, I will say, Darren talks a lot about this Big E character. Darren's family knew him as Big Mike, and he would talk about him a lot, but Darren's family never met this person. And Darren's half-brother, Reginald, said that he thinks he just made this character up. And his brother Reginald said that in general, he just embellishes a lot. He remembers Darren coming home from school and watching cartoons, not being involved in anything related to gangs.
So you're a compulsive liar.
Yeah. If Darren did make this up, I think that it was maybe a way for him to deal with what he was going through in that moment, or he wanted to create a character that he wished was there. He wanted to create somebody who would have stepped in and killed the person who was tormenting him.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when you are more vulnerable in these situations. You want to find somebody who will stick up for you, who will protect you in a way. And it definitely seems like he was looking for protection, but also it sounds like, too, he wanted to appear tougher than he was. Because I'm sure if he's telling his family that he's in a gang, I'm 100% sure he's telling his friends he's in a gang. And I'm sure he's telling it to everybody in the foster home. But to me, that feels more like an attempt to say that I'm this big, tough gangster, and if you mess with me, you're going to have problems, as a way to protect himself if he was being tormented and bullied at this foster home, which in all honesty, I do not doubt, because unfortunately, it has been pretty decently reported that foster homes are not always the best situations a child can end up in.
Exactly. So at the age of 16, Darren was reunited with his mom. And at this point, his mom was about 30 years old, and she was living with a new partner and 2 young children. They moved to Lima, which is a small town in Northwest Ohio. And while I'm sure that Darren was hoping this was a chance to reconnect with his mother and strengthen the bond that he never got the chance to when he was younger, Darren's mother was struggling with schizophrenia and substance use, and she was often physically and verbally abusive to Darren. And this has been confirmed by his half-siblings. In 1990, Darren graduated from high school, and in 1991, he joined the Marines. He moved to San Diego for boot camp and combat training, and from July of 1992 to September of 1993, he was stationed in North Carolina. However, he was shortly discharged from the military, and he was essentially discharged for insubordination. He would often go home without letting people know because he didn't really feel a need to respond to other authority figures. I think this is something we see too with other serial killers, and that they see themselves as the authority figures, so they have trouble maintaining jobs, maintaining positions where they're having to report to somebody else.
Definitely. And I'm assuming he was dishonorably discharged if he's not taking orders, if he's not listening, and he's a subordinate. Especially in the Marines, that is not taken nicely.
The way the podcast phrased it is that he was other than honorably discharged.
He was other than honorably discharged, which is not the same as being dishonorably discharged.
And other than honorable discharge means that the service member will not be entitled to veterans benefits and will not be eligible to reenlist. It is considered an administrative discharge rather than a punitive discharge, which is what a dishonorable discharge would be. But it still may have consequences in civilian life. Around 1993, Darren met a woman named Maria and began dating her. The interesting thing about this relationship is that Darren was around 22 years old and his girlfriend, Maria, was 51.
Oh, that went the opposite of the way I thought it was going to go. I could have sworn you were about to be like, he was 22 and she was 15. And that's the complete opposite of what I thought was going to happen. Interesting. Okay, sir, get you an old lady. I ain't mad about it.
Maria was an Italian immigrant, and she already had kids who were Darren's age. Maria and Darren met through mutual friends, and she described him as kind and quiet, but her son, Ed, never really trusted him based on his demeanor. What Maria saw as kind and quiet, Ed saw as strangely reserved. And Ed also said that he would often see Darren talking to himself and answering himself. I will say I do be talking to myself, but I do that when I am in the comfort of my own home, by myself. I don't talk to myself in front of other people.
I mean, I talk to myself as well. I mean, why wouldn't I consult with the realest person I know? But my question is, quick question. What mutual friends do you have between a 51-year-old and a 22-year-old? By mutual friends, do you mean your son?
For real. It has to be the military.
Got to be. Because I don't have any friends who are in their 50s. That's interesting to me.
It's very interesting. But yeah, so Maria really liked Darren, but her son Ed didn't really trust him.
Yeah, I mean, but also I would never feel comfortable with my parent dating somebody who was close to my age. I barely want my brother to date somebody who's close to my age, and he's only 4 years older than me.
It would be so weird. Because it's like, I can't view you as a step parent. You're a sibling.
You're a sibling at best.
If that. So around 1995, Darren said that he got sucked back into the gang life when his mentor, Big E, was killed. And Maria struggled with this. Darren apparently one time came home and he'd been jumped and had been hit over the head and was bleeding from the head, but told Maria that they couldn't call the police because this was just how gangs operated. They don't involve the police.
This getting back into gang life sounds more like I'm out here doing some stuff I ain't got no business doing with women of the night, as people used to call them. It doesn't sound like gang violence.
I would agree. I think that's what happened, but I can't tell you for sure because I don't even know if you're correct, but I think similarly that he was likely doing some stuff he wasn't supposed to be doing, and somebody hit him upside the head.
Right, and he deserved it.
But either way, to escape, they moved to Austin, Texas, and ended up marrying in 1995 in the city hall in front of some friends. Darren said that Maria provided him with balance and stability. And I really feel like the reason he went for an older woman is it's kind of like an Oedipus complex kind of thing. He wanted a mom. He wanted the mom he never had.
Yes. As soon as you said she provided him structure and stability, I said, yo, mama is supposed to do that. You didn't want a wife, you wanted a mama. Which is understandable. I'm not going to hold that particular piece of this against him because I got plenty of other things to hold against him. But I understand looking for a motherly or fatherly figure in your life. I don't understand marrying them, but I do understand looking for one.
Yeah, agreed. Especially, experiencing what he did early in his life and having the relationship with his mother that he had.
Right.
So Darren ended up getting a job at Dell, which was very exciting for him. I think around 2000, Dell was probably experiencing a lot of growth as we were entering into the internet era. But he also switched jobs pretty often. And Maria's son, Ed, said that he couldn't keep a job because his employers would always figure out that he was creepy. And he would end up being let go for various reasons.
You can only hide that crazy for so long.
Right.
Some people are better than others, but you can only hide it for so long.
Yeah, exactly. He hid it for a while. I will say that. Well, from certain people. Around 2000, Darren moved back to Gary, Indiana with his wife. But by 2003, Darren was unhappy with his marriage. He and Maria were living separately at this point. And he'd expressed to his sister that he wanted a child. And Maria, at almost 60 years old, surely could not provide that for him.
Duh!
If that was something you knew you wanted, why would you marry somebody who you know cannot provide that?
Exactly. Especially you marry somebody with grown kids. So let's say even if God step in and give this woman a baby, right? Why would she want to? She has grown kids. Grown as hell. And again, you're saying I'm unhappy in this marriage and I want children and she can't provide that to me like she was ever going to be able to give you children. It's not like she was only 10, 15 years older than you and you found out she was infertile and now it's causing a rift in your relationship. She knocking on menopause's door. She may have already walked through it, in all honesty.
Right. She might already be in the room.
Exactly. And you're confused and you're upset with her for not being able to give you a children because it's sounding like you don't understand basic anatomy.
Right.
But, per usual, men will always find a way to blame women for their problems in whether it's not being able to have a child, whether it's not being able to provide for them. Men will always find a way to make it the woman's fault.
Exactly. And Maria honestly felt that their marriage had changed. She was also unhappy. And she felt like Darren was stepping out on their marriage. And this feeling was right. Darren told his sister that he'd found another woman that he liked, and she was pregnant.
So not only do you have the audacity to cheat on me, but you giveth another woman your big-headed child.
And big-headed is right, because I'm going to send you these pictures afterwards. This man got a noggin. He got a lot on his mind.
Not a lot on his mind, friend. When I tell you that would be the quickest way for me to end up being the subject of a true crime podcast, is for my husband to have a child with another woman during our marriage. That would be the quickest way for me to end up the subject of one of these podcasts. Quickest way. Because I just feel like it's so disrespectful. Because if you're having a child with another woman, clearly you had unprotected sex with that woman. So not only do you just not care about me, you don't care about my sexual health. You don't care about my mental well-being. You don't care about my ability to trust people going forward in other relationships. You don't care about me at all if you go have another baby with another woman during our marriage.
And my thing is like, if we're both unhappy, let's get a divorce. You don't even have children together.
Divorce is a beautiful thing.
Yeah. His girlfriend, who was also the woman he got pregnant, was a woman named Sharita. And she stated that she liked him at first. And she specifically liked the fact that he didn't drink or do drugs. But she soon discovered his darker side. Darren would get jealous and controlling. And I'm not even talking about like, oh, I don't want you going out with your friends. Why don't you stay home with me? Oh, you're wearing that when you go outside? I'm saying this man would lock her inside the house when he left for work.
Oh no. Oh no, absolutely not. Get out. Please, please get out. If somebody's doing that to you, please get out.
And Sharitha tried to end things, but every time she would attempt to end things, he would threaten her and her mother.
And you carry his big-headed child.
This is while she's pregnant.
Of course it is. Of course it is. Like, I'm sure she's feeling this level of obligation to stay with him and near him because he is the father of her child. And that's so upsetting. And I feel like abusers and manipulators are well aware of the fact that in large, a lot of women are willing to take a lot of BS for the sake of holding a family together. And I feel like because abusers know that, they will push the limits of what is acceptable.
But I feel like because Darren wanted a child, he put his best foot forward until she got pregnant and got to the point where the baby was growing and healthy. And then that's when he decided to switch up.
Yeah, and it's disgusting. It's disgusting that you did that to her. Especially, maybe she really liked you. Maybe she even loved you. And maybe she was so happy to have your child and build a family with you. And then you do that. You turn around and betray her on that level. That's so messed up, dude.
And in 2004, Sharitha and Darren had their child. But shortly after the child was born, the child passed away. There's not much info around what happened, but we do know that their child passed away. But Sharitha was able to get out of the relationship after this happened, and she went into hiding. Darren said that the death of his child caused him to snap, and he specifically blamed Sharitha for his child's death.
Of course he did. Because he can do no wrong, clearly. Everything is everybody else's fault.
Or if something bad happens, it's obviously the woman's fault.
Clearly.
So because Darren blamed Sharitha for their child's death, and she had gone into hiding, he wanted to find her. He expected that Sharitha was staying with a friend of hers, who was a man named David Abram. Darren showed up at David's house and asked where Sharitha was. He then got angry when David Abram denied the fact that Sharitha was there. The next day, he came back with the police and accused David Abram of shooting his cousin. However, David was able to clear this up with police and explain the situation. So police ended up leaving, and so did Darren. So shortly after this, David Abram started hearing around town that Darren wanted to get back at him, and he was planning to blow up his house. Soon after hearing this, David was driving through his neighborhood when he saw Darren going towards his house with a red can of gasoline. David pulled over next to Darren and called the police. Darren was saying that he would blow up David's house if he didn't get Sharitha back. And Sharitha owed him $7,000, which probably was not true.
Let's live in this fairy tale fantasy that he likes to live in and claim that she does owe you $7,000. $7,000 for what, fool? For your pain and suffering?
So by the time police arrived, Darren was waving around the gas canister and was yelling right outside of David's car. And police tried to de-escalate the situation, but Darren would not calm down, and things escalated when Darren poured gasoline on himself and threatened to blow himself up.
This is very unstable. You are very unstable.
So at this point, police instruct David Abram to get away from Darren because we don't know if this man is about to blow himself up. You're right next to him in a vehicle that runs on gasoline. Don't need to be that close. So David began driving back home, but he could see Darren following behind him on foot in his rearview mirror. On his way back home, David saw Sharitha sitting on a porch that was a couple doors down from his and tries to throw her a set of keys and tells her to lock herself inside his house. But at this point, Darren was already approaching her. So Sharitha runs to the back door of David's house with Darren hot behind her. She manages to get inside and lock the door behind her, but Darren then begins kicking at the door. Sharitha hides under a bed, and Darren eventually kicks the door in and begins pouring gasoline all over the house. Since he was pouring gasoline around everywhere, the fumes were really strong and eventually became too much for Sharitha to handle being under the bed. So she crawls out from under the bed, and pretty much immediately, Darren puts her into a headlock and pours gasoline on top of her. I honestly don't know why it took the police so long to get to David Abrams' house, but by this time, police had arrived and were outside of David Abrams' house, but Darren had told them to stay back or he would light the whole house on fire, including himself and Sharitha. Police tried to calm him down, but Darren continued to threaten them. Darren began marching himself and Sharitha, who was still in a headlock, back to his apartment. And it seemed like this was a while away because they passed a whole highway and went down an alleyway. But essentially, Darren tried to go through the back door of his apartment. But by this point, the SWAT team had already gone in through the front door. And as soon as he got in the back door, they grabbed him, and two other officers on the other side were able to grab Sharitha and take her away from Darren.
This poor woman. That has to be the most traumatizing thing I think I've ever heard. Oh, I feel so bad for her. I feel so bad for her.
Especially having police right there, but them not really being able to do anything.
Exactly, because clearly you're dealing with somebody who was already unhinged enough to pour gasoline on you and himself and even threaten to blow something up in the first place. So the police are, no pun intended, handcuffed at this point, because if he's willing to do this, there's no way to know if he is actually willing to set everybody on fire. I too would be inclined to believe him.
Girl, I'm just going to warn you. You're going to want to take a big swig of wine for this next one. So, Darren was initially charged with felony breaking and entering and felony intimidation. However, he took a plea deal that knocked off the intimidation charge, and a judge decided to bump the felony breaking and entering charge down to a misdemeanor at her own discretion. Darren was sentenced to a year in prison and a year on probation.
This dude threatened this woman's life, traumatized her for life, not only with his antics of the gas, but all of that beforehand, with the passing of her child, with all the abuse before her child passed. This man traumatized her and ruined so many memories in this woman's life, and he gets a year in prison. He gets paroled, and you, judge, as a woman, allowed this to go down and just bump things? You, prosecution, offered a plea deal to somebody who clearly has blatant disregard for human life.
Right. This may not be correct, but my understanding of plea deals is that oftentimes they'll take a plea deal to avoid trial because it's not always clear if they'll get that guilty verdict. I do know that sometimes, even if they know they're guilty, they'll just take the deal to avoid trial. Don't have to spend all that money. It's less work. But I'm like, you have all these witnesses. You had the whole police squad. What was the reason for a plea deal?
The SWAT team came in. You had to hire SWAT to get this dude off of her.
Right. And if you wanted to do a plea deal, I don't understand why the plea deal was that forgiving. This man broke into a home, breaking and entering, poured gasoline around, kidnapped somebody from that home. He should have been charged for kidnapping.
Which carries a life sentence in most states.
Exactly. Took y'all on a chase. And the only reason this woman did not die is because y'all stopped him. What about that gives 1 year in prison? What about that gives 1 year in prison?
Especially when I wholeheartedly believe that he had full intentions to kill her. And not only just kill her, but ensure she suffered when she died.
Torture her. He wanted to torture her.
Exactly.
And I mean, he did with the gasoline.
And again, too, it's like, especially like you were saying before, if you're offering plea deals, that also means you think you can't win. You think you can't win at trial. You think you can't win if this goes to trial. You think there's not enough evidence. And to me, if you can't win at a case that seems pretty black and white concerning all the police and SWAT that was there, you, my friend, are a failing prosecutor. This whole system failed her. The entire system failed her in this regard. It is disrespectful how y'all handled this.
Yeah, because if somebody did that to me and all they got was a year, I'm burning something down.
Oh, absolutely. Best believe, too, when I give my victim impact statement, I will be disparaging everybody in that courtroom. The prosecutor, the judge, and the defendant. All of y'all can burn in hell. All of you.
So, in 2006, after leaving prison and finishing probation, Darren moved back down to Austin, Texas, and got an apartment in an area that was known for drugs and prostitution. On December 16th, 2007, Darren solicited a prostitute to come to his apartment. When she got there, it was dark, so she asked if they could turn on a light. Darren asked her if she was a police officer, and after she said that she wasn't, he attacked her. He knocked her down and began choking her, and yelled at her that he could kill her if he wanted. He sexually assaulted her and continued to beat her. Eventually, after hours of this, he let her leave. The next day, she went to the police to report the attack. She gave them his name and address. They eventually located Darren, but he claimed he was innocent and that he'd never met the woman. He said that he'd moved out of the apartment a month before this alleged attack happened. He also agreed to give a DNA sample, but it took 6 months for this DNA to be tested. It was, of course, a match, but for some reason, it took police another 2 months to find and arrest him.
If y'all don't care about women, just say that. Just go ahead and put it on the front door. Because you clearly don't care about women.
Get a megaphone even.
I got one. I can hand it over to you. It's so clear you just don't care about women. And you especially don't care about them if they're a sex worker. There is no reason for that. I understand that processing takes a long time and DNA is not nearly as quick as Law & Order SVU makes it.
But I feel like you could have easily validated whether or not he'd left that apartment. Was he living in that apartment when it happened?
Exactly. You could very easily go to a landlord, get a lease. You could have done your job and investigated his blatant lies, and you didn't do that.
I'm sorry again, girl. But Darren was initially charged with 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, which could have gotten him a 99-year sentence. However, he got a plea deal where if he pled guilty, he'd only have to serve 5 years. He was also labeled as a low-risk offender. The DA office said that they were completely unaware of his event with Sharitha because it was labeled as a misdemeanor. But my thing is, even if that had not happened, this man beat and sexually assaulted a woman for hours. How is that low risk?
How, Sway?
I don't care if he'd never even gotten as much as a traffic ticket on his record. How is that low risk?
Dude, and you saying that reminds me, I watched a prosecutor talk about this. Just because your first crime is first-degree murder doesn't mean you get less time or less treated like a murderer because you never got a traffic ticket. To say that he was low risk when he showed extreme violence towards this woman, Why do we have to prove he's a flight risk or prove that he's highly dangerous when he beat a woman for hours? Does that not seem dangerous to you?
Right. Like on the sex offender registry, he was listed as low risk. If I see low risk, I'm thinking you got caught having sex in public. You got caught peeing in public.
Right.
You did something that did not cause harm to anybody else.
Public indecency, even. Like if you're like drunkenly outside and you like take your shirt off and your tits are out for the world, that's public indecency. That can technically get you on the sex offender registry. I definitely don't think that anybody who assaulted somebody with proof, because you have his DNA, so you know he did it. So he full on assaulted somebody and he was low risk.
Why did he get a plea deal? You have the DNA, you have the statement.
Especially because he got a plea deal on charges that carry a life sentence. Call it 99 years, whatever you want to call it. He was going to die in prison. And you offered him 5 years in prison for something that would have made him die in prison? What? I'm again questioning your discretion at this point.
I agree. So unfortunately, Darren was released in July of 2013 after serving 5 years. After this, he moved back to Gary, Indiana. And when he got there, he wasn't on probation or parole. All he had to do was sign up for the sex offender registry. And while I would think you got off very easy, the easiest even, Darren would disagree. And I'm just going to warn our listeners, this next statement is likely to be very offensive for anybody who is sensitive to issues around sex work and or sexual assault. So skip ahead about 10 to 15 seconds. Darren basically stated that because the woman was a prostitute, it wasn't sexual assault. He paid for it. So he didn't see what the problem was.
They never do. People who are abusers never do. Someone who has a history of sexually assaulting people would never think it's a problem.
So when Darren came to Indiana, he ended up moving in with his brother Reginald. His brother said that Darren would often go out for walks and would disappear for a couple of days. And knowing what his brother knows now, he started questioning what he was doing while he was gone for those stints. Next, I'm going to cover a couple of crimes that Darren committed, but just know that this is not the full extent. The first confirmed murder that we have after Darren's prison sentence was of a woman named Tierra Beatty in January 2014, just a few months after he was released from prison. Tierra was a 28-year-old woman, and after her disappearance, her fiancé, Marvin Clinton, was investigating it himself because he was receiving little support from the police. And he found that someone had stolen her phone and was using it to talk to sex workers. This person, of course, ended up being Darren. Marvin gave the phone over to police, but after Darren's arrest, Marvin learned that the police had lost the phone records he'd given them. While Darren is completely responsible for the crimes that he committed, I think that the police in Chicago, Gary, and Austin were responsible for this as well, because there were so many opportunities to catch this man. He did not make it hard. If y'all knew that he had this woman's phone, you could have probably tracked it. This was 2014.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what you said in the first episode when he said the Gary police don't work on weekends. Your laziness and your disregard for these actions resulted in the death of all these women. And I can say that confidently. Because if you had done your job, he wouldn't be a serial killer.
Right. And if you're listening and you're like, well, hindsight is 2020. They could never have known this man was a serial killer. So if you do want to play devil's advocate, and as our grandmas would say, the devil don't need no advocate.
Amen.
Just strap in for this next one. So on February 19th, 2014, just a month after Tierra Beauty had disappeared, Darren contacted a woman on Backpage.com. This woman, named Sarah, met him at one house, and he then asked her to drive him to another one because, remember, he does not have a car. He directed her to this other house, and as she was getting out of the car, Darren ambushed her and put a knife to her neck and told her to get in the house. He made Sarah hand over her cell phone and car keys and started asking her questions about who knew she was there, who might she have told about this meetup, etc. Darren then sexually assaulted her and tormented her. When she tried to escape, he bound her. After hours of doing this, Darren gagged her and threw a coat over her head and led her to the car outside and started driving. At this point, Sarah was sure that he was taking her somewhere to kill her. The car stopped at a light that happened to be right outside of a pool hall. Sarah saw this opportunity, got the gag out of her mouth, and began screaming for help. Two older men, who happened to be standing outside of the pool hall, heard her screaming, saw her tied up in the back of the car, and they pulled out their guns and stopped Darren at the intersection and tried to make him get out of the car so that they could get Sarah out.
A good Samaritan. Good Samaritans. I'm proud of y'all.
After one of these men fired a warning shot, Darren ran out of the car and ran away. Because he is indeed a So Sarah, of course, goes to the police after this and explained to them what happened. But from the moment she got there, she could tell that they weren't really hearing her or seeing her as a victim. They saw her as a sex worker. And she didn't even want to press charges because one of the officers told her, and again, if you are very sensitive to topics of sexual assault or sex work, I will just ask you to skip ahead around 10 seconds. But Sarah didn't even want to press charges because the officer told her, and I quote, "If he paid you, then it wouldn't have been rape, right?" End quote.
You should lose your job. You should have lost your job. You should have lost your badge. You should have been never allowed to work in any capacity that deals with helping people because clearly you don't care about people. That is the most absurd thing ever.
Because this man beat her, kidnapped her, bound her, had her tied up, driving her to an unknown location.
Held her up at knife point.
The only reason she is sitting in that interrogation room right now, only reason she's sitting there is because they happened to get stopped at a red light.
Because he would have killed her. He would have. And you sit here after she tells you her story, after she tells you that she was held at knife point and all of this stuff was done against her will. You tell her that if you were paid, then you weren't assaulted. I was paid for an act that I agreed to. I was not paid for an act that I did not agree to. Thus, it is assault. I was paid to do my job. If I'm not doing my job, it is assault.
Exactly. And she's recounting this to another officer who is trying to go back and figure out Darren's activities after Afrikka Hardy's death. And this officer just shakes his head. And he apologizes that she was told that. But at that point, the damage has already been done.
Exactly. And that officer should have been retroactively fired, in my opinion. I know he's not going to be because police protect police, but he should have been retroactively fired once they found out that he did that.
So despite going through all of this with the police, Sarah still told police what happened in detail. She told police that this man's name was Darren, and she also gave the address where she'd been held. And do you want to take a guess what this address was, Dev? It was across the street from his brother's house where he was staying. She also went to the hospital to complete a sexual assault kit, but this kit sat on a shelf for a year. Imagine if police had done an ounce of the work. So let's say, for instance, there's a backlog of sexual assault kits that need to be processed. She doesn't want to press charges. Y'all don't want to go for it. You know there is somebody out here doing something this violent. You have their first name. You have the house that they took this person to. You go to that house, and you might look for sex offenders in that area, and you would quickly find that there is a sex offender that lives in a house directly across from there with the first name Darren. I feel like 8-year-olds playing Clue would have done a better job at doing the detective work in this case than the officers who were assigned to it.
Oh, because I'm sure an 8-year-old actually cares. You forgot that is the most important aspect of this. When you care about what's happening to these women, when you treat them like people, that forces you to do investigation work. That forces you to figure out what happened. But when you don't care about them because all you think they are sex workers and they're not people to you, why would they care, Cam? Why would they do the work of investigating? Because if you were paid, you weren't assaulted. So why would I do my job when I don't even believe that you were assaulted in the first place?
Why would I do my job if I have the same mindset as the person who assaulted you?
Facts. Oh, this is making my skin itch.
Now we come back to October 2014. After Afrikka Hardy has been found dead in a motel in Hammond, and police have arrested Darren. While Darren said that he wanted to speak to the prosecutor to get the plea deal that would give him the death penalty, he did begin telling them about other murders that he committed. However, he avoided speaking on certain things because he didn't want to go outside of the jurisdiction of the Indiana police because that would slow down his plea deal process even more.
But also, you're in here giving your confession and you're still prioritizing you over all the women that you've killed. I don't want to admit to killing these women in other jurisdictions because it is inconvenient for my life if I admit that I killed women outside of this jurisdiction. What?
Right. And Darren claimed that he doesn't know how many people he's killed. He said it could be right around 100 or over 100, but this is a point where I will say we have to keep in mind that Darren often embellishes facts about his life. He did say, though, that he has not only killed women, but when he's killed men, it's usually been for hire or for somebody else. Again, keep in mind that Darren often embellishes facts about his life.
I do not believe that he killed 100 people at all. I feel like he made that number up because that would put him in the realm of extremely prolific serial killers. And he wanted others to think more highly of him. Highly in the sense of him being dangerous, of him being somebody that needs to be feared. But I do not for half a second believe that this dude killed 100 or so people. I don't believe that at all.
I agree. Darren didn't stop at just telling the police that he'd killed these women. He also showed them where he'd put their bodies. So when in the car with the officers, showing them around to the places that he'd left these women's bodies at, one of the officers tried to get Darren to open up by mirroring his emotions, but she had a hard time because Darren was so relaxed.
That is a very good interrogation tactic, I will say.
Yeah, but it says something that you're leading me to a dead body and you're this relaxed. You're being arrested for killing multiple people and you're this relaxed. Sociopath. The first house that he led them to was the house where Darren said that he killed another person who he only knew as Casper. And this happened shortly before he killed Afrikka. Darren told him that this woman's body was in the basement. And as police entered the basement, they immediately began to smell death. They found the woman's corpse and confirmed that she had been strangled. The woman was identified as 35-year-old Anneth Jones. Detectives then convinced Darren to take them to another building. Here, Darren said that there would be another body covered in plywood in the garage of an abandoned building. Detectives found this body and later identified this woman as Tierra Beatty. And if you remember, Tierra Beatty was the woman who disappeared in January of 2014 and whose fiancé had been investigating her disappearance by himself. Darren then directs them to a third house where they find another decomposing body, which is almost skeletal, at the top of the house. He continues to lead them to 3 other houses where they find 3 women's bodies, all strangled, and most of them left in abandoned houses. In addition to Afrikka Hardy, the names of Darren's confirmed victims are Tierra Beatty, Aneth Jones, Sonia Billingsley, Tanya Gatlin, Tracy Martin, and Christine Williams. And while the exact date of every single crime is not known, officials believe that these happened between August of 2013 and October of 2014.
I have a very specific kind of anger for crimes that should have never happened. And you had countless occasions to lock this man away for life, to put him behind bars for the rest of his life. And for some reason, you gave him chance after chance after chance when he showed you that he was not any better, when he proved that he had no interest of getting better. And yet you gave him chance after chance after chance. And now 7 families have to grieve the loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend, because you didn't put away somebody who on several occasions showed you that he did not deserve to walk amongst society. And that is your burden to bear. And this is one particular instance where I don't believe in, oh, you shouldn't feel guilty about things you can't control. You could have controlled this. So you should feel guilty and you should feel bad.
At the very least, when somebody survived, told you what had happened, gave you his first name, gave you the address, if they would have processed that sexual assault kit, they would have easily been able to match his DNA because it was already in CODIS because he had been in prison for 5 years for sexual assault.
Right. He's on the registry. The registry exists for a reason. He's on the registry. Just do a search for people named Darren. And then you can narrow it down to just the people that live in Gary. There was such an unnecessary mishandling of this case on every level. Not only on the investigation level, but on the prosecutory level. Because the only person who can offer a deal is the prosecutor. So yeah, prosecutor, I'm looking at you crazy 2. Judge who dropped his felony to a misdemeanor, I'm looking at you crazy 3. I'm looking at all of you crazy. All of y'all enabled this behavior. All of y'all enabled him to kill on this caliber. All of you.
So, it actually took a long time for everything to come to trial. There were multiple delays for various reasons. And while there had been press conferences about what had happened, many people did not know the details of this case until the past couple years because the judge had placed a gag order to avoid biasing the jury, which makes sense. So Darren didn't want to agree to the deal until he knew he was getting the death penalty, and to entice them, he claimed to know locations and other information regarding unsolved cases. I don't doubt this because this man is obviously unhinged, but just remember that he does embellish for his benefit. He essentially wanted to sign a plea bargain that would guarantee the death penalty in exchange for info on other cases. But in a bit of sweet karma, Darren was sentenced to life in prison on May 25th, 2018. So he did not get his wish to be killed before his next birthday, which would have been March of 2015. He did not get the death penalty. He just got life. What is odd is that the judge kept the gag order active even after the trial ended, supposedly to protect any information for any appeals that Darren might file. But Darren was very clearly uninterested in appealing this case. Again, I'm going to name the 7 confirmed victims of Darren Vann. Afrikka Hardy, Tierra Beatty, Aneth Jones, Sonia Billingsley, Tanya Gatlin, Tracy Martin, and Christine Williams. At this point, police are unsure of how many people Darren Vann has killed. But what is clear is that Darren preyed on women who were disconnected from their families and their loved ones, and women who he saw as less than human. And I feel like people often make a comment, sometimes in jest, that there are no Black serial killers. And what I tell them is that unfortunately there are. However, serial killers often kill people within their same race. And so if there are Black serial killers, they're killing Black women. And they are aware that the deaths of Black women are not going to be investigated as intensely and as efficiently as the deaths of white women. And they benefit from this fact. I know people think there are multiple serial killers operating in Chicago right now who have not been caught simply because they are targeting Black women. And some of them are targeting Black sex workers. And as we've seen, police do not consider these people to be worth their time. So that is the end of this story. Do you have any other thoughts, friend?
My thoughts are, I kind of already expressed them, but just the general mishandling of this case aggravates me on a level that I do not think I can thoroughly explain. When it is your job to protect people, when it is your job to listen to people, when it is your job to believe victims, to shun them is the ultimate slap in the face. To shun them is the ultimate disrespect. To disregard their safety, their well-being, their existence as a human being is a slap in the face. And he committed a crime that would have gotten him 99 years in prison. There is no reason to believe that he would not have committed the same crime again. And in my opinion, they had 3 separate opportunities to do that. And they didn't take any of them.
Agreed. And he clearly didn't see anything wrong with what he did, so there wasn't even a basis for some reconciliation and rehabilitation.
Again, I'm just a voice on the internet who watches a lot of prosecutors and defense attorneys talk about stuff like this. But to me, it just sounds like you didn't want to go to trial and you gave him a plea deal so that you didn't have to eat up your week in trial. And I understand that caseloads are high, especially in Chicago. That's another reason why I think he ran rampant near Chicago as opposed to doing it in Austin, Texas. Because unfortunately, there is a very high crime rate in and near Chicago.
Especially for Black women.
Especially for Black women. So I understand not having the capacity to go to trial. I understand being overworked. I understand being overloaded. But this is not the one you don't take to trial. This is not the one that you don't see to it that this person dies in prison. This was not the one. There was just so much mishandling on this, and I'm devastated that these women had to deal with that, and those families had to deal with that, and even his survivors, the survivors of this man were so disrespected. I wish them the best. I wish that they are continuing with their life, that they are happy, that they are healthy, that they have been able to go to therapy and deal with the circumstances of this the best way that they know how. And I hope that all the families of the victims are okay and that they have made peace with this situation the best way that they know how. Darren, I hope you burn in hell. And with that, that's all I got, friend.
This was a tough case.
Yeah.
Listeners, if you're interested in learning more about this case and hearing audio clips from interviews done with Afrikka Hardy's mother, Lori, or Marvin Clinton, the fiance of Tierra Beauty, as well as audio clips from Darren himself in his conversations with police and other people who've been involved in this case, I highly recommend checking out the Algorithm podcast. I will say I nerded out on this podcast just a little bit because the basis of this podcast is actually a man named Thomas Hargrove developed a predictive model using crime data to identify where there are potential serial killers operating. Years before Darren was captured, he identified Gary, Indiana, as having a serial killer, specifically somebody who was strangling women and leaving them in abandoned houses. He sent this information to the police department in the area, and they essentially ignored him. And I nerded out because I'm a data scientist and I work a lot around predictive modeling and data analysis. So it was very interesting to me that somebody had used public data around crimes to build a model that could predict where there was a serial killer operating. And that's the basis of this podcast, but it specifically dives deep into Afrikka Hardy, Darren Vann, and his other victims, such as Tierra Beauty. They have a whole episode on Tierra Beauty and everything that her fiance did to try and figure out what happened to her. I think it was a really well done podcast, so that cannot recommend it enough.
That's incredibly interesting. And as somebody who did not hear about this case or know about this case before today, I will now also go binge watch this podcast and listen to everything that we did not cover here.
I did not cover all the information that they covered in that podcast. It has like 12 episodes or something like that. So I did not want to have y'all here for hours, but there's a lot of rich information in the podcast. And yeah, again, cannot recommend it enough. But thank you so much to our listeners for joining us on this episode. Again, I want to thank the Algorithm podcast for providing most of the material for this episode. And if you'd like to check out photos related to this case, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram and TikTok.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish podcast. And if you're listening on Spotify, please feel free to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.